nice Thursday evening. I just wanted to do one little quick survey. How many people in this room, by show of hands, has had water in their basement in the last 4 days? Okay, yeah, that's a pretty good representation of 4 people.
I just said damn.
We had a lot of rain, and I think there's some folks from suburbs. You had tremendous rains there as well. Yeah, so we had just under a foot of rain over a 48-hour period. So we've been with Catherine's help. She was here on Sunday. Catherine, who's at the back there, who's going to video this. She was on the scene when the first ideas of what happened out there were revealed in the morning, and it's pretty extensive. I mean, we had a lot of water flow through the garden, but we've got it pretty well put back together. There's still a few weak areas out there, but we're grateful, like, for the community support that we had for putting those pathways in out there, the concrete pathways, which after floods it was so difficult to get any kind of wheelchairs or walkers or strollers or anything out there. It was difficult, and now because we did those weak areas in concrete, we had no damage in those areas. And in 2018, when we had the same scale of the storm, it was tremendous damage. And I think we spent really a good part of 3 weeks putting the garden back together. And for the most part, we're gonna have it back together by the end of the day tomorrow. There's gonna be a few weak areas out there, but everything is gonna be fully operational and functional. So really grateful for all that support. Summer Festival is, excuse me, next weekend. That's gonna be great. There's 2 full days of fantastic events going on out in the garden, so I hope you're able to join us for that. There's all kind. I think the schedule's on the website, if I'm not mistaken. I haven't actually looked, but and so next month's lecture, Nature and Seasons in Rinpa Paintings, which I'm learning. I'm not familiar, and so excited about that. And then the month after is another professor from UW-Madison, part of the Center for East Asian Studies. Professor Sarah Thal will talk about chivalry, stoicism, and the way of samurai in modern Japan. So I'm really excited to hear about that. Samurai is one of her areas of extreme expertise. So super excited about that. So so you mentioned the Center for East Asian Studies, and Professor D'Etcheverry is also part of the Center for East Asian Studies. We're grateful. David Fields, the Associate Director of the center, and the center has been a great supporter of Anderson Gardens, have helped, have contributed to our summer festival, and we greatly appreciate that support. And then talking with David at it was an event we had here. I think it was a sponsor event, and we started talking about our lecture series, and he's like, we've got some people that really, I think, could really fit into your presentations, and so he connected me with Professor D'Etcheverry, and we talked, and the idea of, she's a specialist in Tales of Genji, among other things, a classic bit of Japanese literature, and so here she is. I'm really excited about this presentation. And I'm going to throw this out there because I watched the most recent Shogun series, and I see there's like poet, and I know it's probably kind of a kitschy to some degree.
I think it's great. Sorry, and the actor, what's his name, Sanada Hiroyuki, is amazing, and he also stars in one of my favorite buddy movies in Japan, the Onmyoji series, which are old now, but set at the same time as the Tale of Genji. Features some beautiful gardens if you're into experiencing it vicariously like that.
So there was bits of poetry used in the series, and I thought, somehow it's going to connect.
There are some connections, and I have to say I have not been watching the Shogun series. Is this terrible to admit? I have not. I hear wonderful things, and I have colleagues across the Midwest and the US, I'm sure, who are watching it and planning on incorporating it into their classes. And I get to teach other eras as well as other regions these days. And so that's Sarah's baby. And Sarah Thal, who will speak later this season. She and I have been writing partners together, and she's fabulous and great fun and has a very good sense of humor. So I do not know the extent to which she will incorporate those things into her presentation, but she's an excellent person to sidetrack if you can.
All right. Well, please give a warm welcome to
Thank
Professor
you.
D'Etcheverry.
Can you all hear me properly? Yes. All right, thank you. I will do my best to keep the volume audible, but not deafening. But this is a bit of a challenge for me, the not deafening part, because I am a huge Tale of Genji fangirl. And actually right now, one of the major dramas airing in Japan is a Tale of Genji adaptation, which I am also not watching. I'm going to be in Japan next week for a few weeks teaching a summer course, and I plan to binge watch when I'm not teaching then. So it is not a snub to Shogun when I say I'm not watching it, because I'm not watching the Genji adaptation either, and that really is a sweet spot for me. So thank you to Tim for this wonderful invitation. I have been at UW-Madison my entire career, so since fall 2000, so I'm entering my 24th year as an academic in the upper Midwest. I'm a native New Englander to begin with, similar latitude, so I really love the seasons, love the gardens, and my husband Jody, who's up in the corner, and we have been here a number of times and brought our son, now first entering freshman in college at UW-Madison, and so I was so delighted by the invitation and tickled to be here. And when Tim said, well, there are summer slots available, and it's in or near the garden, I thought, Tale of Genji, gardens in summer. This is something I could be excited to speak about, and that might be fun to hear about. I, of course, did not know all of the rains that would come when I agreed to give that. And while misery, I do not think, loves company, it is also true that there have been other parts of the country very recently inundated, including my beloved northern New England. So I was telling Tim that the town where I grew up and the town where my brother lives, two separate towns, Northeast Kingdom, Vermont, and North Country, part of New Hampshire, have also been flooded historically lately. And so it was very serious. And so when I was revisiting my slides, which I drafted a while ago because I was really excited about this talk, I thought, I'm not going to be terribly serious. I'm going to try to emphasize some of the play and the gamesmanship that is involved in a lot of traditional Japanese arts, it turns out, particularly the fictional garden that is in the Tale of Genji. So I'll talk a little bit about what I mean when I say Tale of Genji and fiction, gardens, and otherwise in a minute. But first, there are three things that would be helpful to take on board as we start. Okay? And they're these. So there are a lot of ways to think about gardens, and I'm pretty sure everyone in this room has thought about them more seriously and definitely has greener thumbs than I do. So I just want to stipulate that the way I want to think about it, because I'm wanting us to have some fun and be a little playful, is to think about gardens as puzzles. Not the kind of puzzle that only has one answer, right? That's the least interesting kind of puzzle, but rather that they are challenges to the viewer. And in the world of early Japanese stories, say circa year 1000, they are puzzles for the reader, so that they're an opportunity for characters to share messages with each other and to be misunderstood by each other and to try to say competing things at once in case their message is not received well. They can say, no, I meant this, right? So playful messages, right? So, and they tell us something about the people who live in them and the people who design them, right? In the story, fictional story, year 1000 Japan, that we're going to be talking about, okay? To solve those puzzles, right, we need to pay attention to the plants, what colors they are, what their names are, what they're associated with, right? This is not unique to Japan. If you think of pansy as being for remembrance, you will have some sense of the floral language that exists in other traditions too, okay? But not just plants, but different landscape features, directions, buildings, bridges, and even sort of basic components of garden design, like water. Where is it? How much of it is there? What shape is it? How quickly does it move? All of these things become keys for reading the garden, for solving the puzzle, for understanding one of the many possible messages that might be hidden there. Okay? Now this is all in the world of make-believe for most of the purposes of my talk, but I just want to preview, and we'll talk a very little bit about this at the end of the hour, that this kind of playful game, setting a puzzle through a garden, is also something that happened in real life. And some of these puzzle gardens, if you want to think about them this way, were inspired by the Tale of Genji. But some of them predate it, so over a millennium ago, people are creating real gardens to send messages. And these messages might be philosophical in nature, the garden as a thought problem, a koan, if you're familiar with Buddhist writing. I don't know much about that, but there's writing on that in English that you can find. I can help you find if you're interested. But more to the point for my talk, given my title, Love, Politics, and Plants, that how you design your garden can also suggest a political message. Not necessarily a political stance. I know we live in highly partisan times, and that's not what I mean here, but really a form of image control and image presentation so that you can court people's sympathies, not for a particular platform, but for yourself as a person in the world who might be in what we could think of anachronistically as a kind of political office. Okay? So we're going to sneak up on that via this premise that gardens and their designers are puzzles, and that we can start to think about solutions to those puzzles, open-ended puzzles, competing solutions, by paying attention to plants and other features of the landscape, both natural and built. Okay, so first a little bit of background. So the story that I'm going to talk about, have us think together about, is called The Tale of Genji. This is, for people who care, I'm not really invested in this, but it's usually the one fact people know if they've heard of The Tale of Genji. This is considered the world's first novel. And by that, the people who make that claim seem to mean that it is the first extended length investigation of the interior life. That you spend a lot of time getting to know people through their thoughts and their emotions, which conveniently for me, even if I'm not too invested in that description of the book, conveniently for me, are often laid bare. The thoughts are often expressed through descriptions of gardens and things like that. So there is a very long history of paying attention to plants and gardens in the Tale of Genji in Japan. So I'll talk a little bit about that, including its hero, who is pictured as a kind of celebrity being hounded by paparazzi in the image from a modern spoof that I've got in the upper left. We'll then think about, and we'll have a puzzle associated with that warm-up background information on Genji. We'll then think about the political layout of the city he lived in, now known as Kyoto. So Kyoto was a real city 1,000 years ago. It wasn't called that, it was called Heian-kyo, but it doesn't really matter. It was in essentially the same place with essentially the same layout. So we'll think about what that layout of that real city 1,000 years ago, and then the layout of Genji's fictional garden, which occupies a chunk of prime real estate in that city. We'll think about what clues that gives us to reading gardens, and I'll have a sort of slightly more challenging warm-up puzzle there, where we think about what can we learn from how he laid out his garden, just in terms of the plan of it, what is where. After all of that, we will be prepared to think about one of the many poems that Genji and his friends write about that garden. And it will be my assertion that most of the poems written about Genji's gardens have secret messages for the other characters and for the reader. And at one level, it might communicate one thing to the characters, but to the reader it might suggest something else. And usually the message to the reader includes the possibility that it's a warning, that things are not going to end well. When I teach Genji, which I do every few years, I'm teaching it again this fall at UW, I always say, if you like happy endings, this is not the book for you. Right? Nothing lasts. Life is impermanent. And love is disastrous. Right? So Even happy poems can be read as a puzzle, suggesting you think it looks good, but dun, 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 things are going to end badly. And you can even do that, it turns out, by referring to plants and other features of gardens, including Genji's imaginary garden. So we will think together about a poem that can be read 6 ways from Sunday, as most interesting things can, and we'll see what you see in it. The advantage of speaking to people who love gardens is they always see things that I don't. I have been blessed to have many auditors sit in on my Genji class over the last 2 decades, and those who garden always teach me things. So I really do look forward to hearing from everybody, because we all see things differently anyway, but if you spend any time with plants, you're gonna see stuff that I've missed, and I wanna hear about it. Okay. If we have time, we'll think about how an actual garden that may or may not have inspired Genji's gardens, we'll think about what that garden might teach us about places like Anderson Gardens, and the ways in which gardens can be used in the real world to do real things, to set things that we might, playing a little bit fast and loose here, think of as puzzles for people to savor and enjoy, that are communicating something. And whether you read that as political in nature, that's something, or something else, is up to you, right? But we'll talk about that. So that's the plan. I would ask you if you are okay with it, but I don't have another option, so this is what I'm gonna do. And you can derail me as you wish. I can tell you, maybe Sarah is not easily derailed, I don't know, but I definitely am, and my students always take advantage of that. So make this time work for you, because I get to teach Genji in the fall anyway, so I wanna talk with you about things you wanna know about. All right, so background. I mentioned that Tale of Genji, about 1,000 years old, may or may not be the world's first novel. There are people in classics, and by that I mean Western classics, who say, no, there's a Roman, Greek, I can't remember, novel known as The Golden Ass, and that is actually the world's first novel. So if you care, this is a contested claim that Genji is that book. But I will tell you that it's a fascinating read. It is a great big soap opera, and so that it probably does share with Shogun, and if you're enjoying that, you should read this book. In a nutshell, our hero, here in a modern tourist mascot postcard rendition from a city that features scenes that are imagined into the tale, Genji is born a prince, and then he gets booted out of the imperial family. The imperial treasury can only afford so many princes, and once you have the heir and a spare or 6, they're just costing you something, right? So Genji gets demoted to commoner status, although he is still more elite than yours truly will ever be. And this is endlessly frustrating for him, because he was born and raised in the palace. He has aristocratic imperial tastes, and he has a particular taste for aristocratic and imperial women. And the problem with that is that, 1, he always wants women he can't have, and 2, many of those women are already married to other people, including emperors and princes. And if you live in a monarchy, maybe generally, and especially if you live in a a monarchy that claims descent from the sun goddess, then keeping the lineage pure is super important. So you do not want a handsome and charismatic prince, which is what Genji is, despite that rendition. You don't want a charismatic prince trying to seduce imperial women, because then you might end up with the wrong baby named crown prince, the wrong prince on the throne, and that might not make the sun goddess too happy. And indeed, there are lots of fictional stories involving this happening and the gods being less than amused. But we are keeping things light. So I will simply note this, that because Genji is so frustrated that he can't have what he wants, which may or may not be the throne, that he can't have who he wants, which may or may not be his stepmother, the empress, he frets and he mopes a lot. And pretty much everything he does culturally, at which he's excellent, he's a snazzy dresser, he dances well, he writes fabulous poetry, everything he does communicates this. His passion for women he can't have, his dissatisfaction with the status quo, political, romantic, you name it. So, puzzle number 1. How is Genji communicating himself here? We see our hero, again, this is not a year 1000 illustration, this is from about 15 years ago. We see Genji wearing his purple robe. There are a lot of wonderful essays, even in English, talking about the world of Heian period, year 1000 period plant dyes, which created rich and wonderful colors, including a deep purple known as murasaki, and if you know the Tale of Genji, the author is known as Murasaki Shikibu, for reasons that we could go into, but that name is also the name of a plant whose roots, when compressed, exude a liquid that creates a really lovely purple dye. And there are lots of poems about that plant and lots of wordplay involving the color of that dye, and for those reasons. Wearing purple across pre-modern Japanese arts, generally, including during the period of Shogun, if you see a character with a purple headband on, in a lot of Japanese artworks, that's going to suggest that they have a secret passion, right? So color as symbolizing, hinting at passionate feelings, often romantic ones, typically romantic ones, right? All right, so we have our guy. He's got his purple shirt on. He's also wearing a particular shade of yellow. I don't know if the people who did this postcard were thinking of that shade of yellow, but one of the shades of yellow associated with plants, the mountain rose or yamabuki, mountain rose is one translation for it, another is primrose. The yellow is known as silent or kuchi-nashi iro. And there are tons and tons of poems about how you look at those mountain roses, which we all understand in year 1000 Japan at the court to be silent yellow, and it's suggesting I'm holding back. I'm not speaking my feelings. But of course, if you're wearing the color that suggests you're holding back, everybody knows that you're holding back. So how silent are you really being, right? So, a question, right? And remember, these puzzles don't have one answer. It's really like, what does this make you think of? Why would our prince, why would he wear a purple robe? Why would he wear yellow pants? And why wear them together? Right? Imagine you're Genji and you're secretly having an affair with, oh, is this a spoiler? All right. Imagine that he's secretly having an affair with someone he should not, which is pretty much his job description as a character. Why on earth wear a purple robe, passion all over your chest? Why wear it with those silent pants? I do not have a right answer in mind. I think it's an interesting question to ask. Is there an effect of that for you? I've asked my students, hey, if I came in wearing, and sometimes I do this to entertain them and myself, if I wear plaid on top and paisley on bottom, what's your conclusion about my aesthetic sense, about my mental state this morning when I got dressed, or about how much laundry I need to do? So, if you know that purple is passion, and this golden yellow is silence about feelings that you can only just hold back, what would you think if you saw somebody wearing those? How does that read to you?
Pretty obvious.
Pretty obvious, yeah, okay, so?
Yeah. I mean, it seems obvious that he's in love with someone.
Yes.
That he can't speak about. So
Yes.
it's forbidden love.
Forbidden love, and he wants you to know about it.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, yeah.
So how secret were his affairs? Was it generally known?
Okay, so one, this is all made up. Two, huge differences of opinion
Okay.
across the millennium of commentary that the Tale of Genji has inspired, some of which is available in English translation that you can read. Some people are like, he was totally having an affair and everybody knew. Commentator two, maybe in the same time period, maybe 200 years later when the reputation of the imperial family has shifted somewhat. Even though Genji is made up, right? This is not like, nobody's thinking, oh, Genji was this person. I mean, there were people who were thinking that, but it's like nobody has established a clear connection. So person one, he's having an affair. Two, no, he's not having an affair. Three, what are you talking about? This book isn't about affairs. It's about Buddhism. Genji is there to teach us that life is suffering. He's there to make it obvious that life is suffering, to be in love is to be on the verge of tears all the time, because life is suffering, because nothing lasts, right? Other thoughts on, like, you see somebody wearing this color combination, and you know that purple is passion, and yellow is forcing it back down, forcing yourself not to speak.
Who's the guy on the left? He's wearing purple too.
So this is actually a detail from a larger postcard. It's 3 depictions of Genji.
All Genji, okay.
And he's all dressed
Because
up.
if he's talking to somebody else wearing purple and holding it.
No, but this is
So why are you making it show him? Maybe
Absolutely.
it's a clan.
Yeah, maybe it's a clan, and maybe it's not just Genji, right? Like, so maybe some people, actually, thank you so much for speaking up, because there are people who say, it's not about passion. This would never have happened in the imperial family. No, this is what it's like to live in, what's the word? A polygamous society. So not polygamy, right? Because it's only the men who have multiple wives. It doesn't work the other way. You're 1000 Japan. So what's it like? All of the men are going around complaining about this, and all the women who dye their clothes and sew their clothes and are the recipients of this affection are seething furiously about it. So there's this reading of the book too, that it's like a takedown of marital norms and political norms, and the norm that marriage is politicized. Because if you're an aristocrat, if you're an imperial family member, and you are going to reproduce, right? You got to keep that imperial divine bloodline clean, right? But then if you're non-imperial, you're doing your best to marry people into that. So tracking who begets whom becomes this huge political question, and marriage ends up being what it is in maybe other times and places. It's a political alliance, right? And so romance is clandestine. The partners you choose have to be secret, right? And so somebody might look at that color combination. I wouldn't have thought of this if you hadn't spoken up in the context of gardens, but they might look at that color combination and say, wow, here's this guy, he's wearing a court cap, which is what that hat is meant to be. And that's public role. And his clothing, like the cut, this is like the court 3-piece suit equivalent, but the colors are telling us, look, I'm playing the public role. I'm dressing like you want me to, but this is how I feel. I'm marrying who you want me to, but I want someone else. So there's that reading of the book too.
Does the red belt have any significance?
I wonder. I think, so there are definitely word plays involving the cords that tie the robes together and then the cuffs of the sleeves together. There's a whole series of word plays involving those elements, not the color. There may well be, I don't know the color symbolism here, but there may well be something important when a character is described as wearing a particular cord. And I've actually done some research on that, so I could talk about it later. But I just want to stress, this is not like Genji's actual outfit in the book. He's a huge clothes horse. He's always wearing different things, but the combinations are always meaningful. And if you ever find yourself in UW-Madison, our special collections acquired this lovely book. It's in Japanese, but I had my students write up a guide, and I would be happy to take you through it. They have little swatches dyed they reproduced the natural dye. So somebody took the roots of a Gromwell plant, the Murasaki, smushed them, got that nice juicy purple dye out of it, and then dyed a swatch of silk. And you can look through and see all the different colors, and then there are dictionaries saying, oh, this color means that, and this color, and this plant signifies that. I remember having an advisor in Japan who said, do you know what this plant means? And I said, no. I said, that's what plant dictionaries are for. Tim, you can imagine how that was not the right thing to say. He was like, no, you need to memorize this. I still have my plant dictionary. I feel okay with my choice to buy a plant dictionary because my mind doesn't work like that. But anyway, this stuff matters. I think I saw a hand, yeah.
So I find it interesting because the purple and the yellow are complementary on a color wheel.
Ooh.
Yeah.
So then it's, oh, that's perfect. Thank you for speaking up. Because if you take the book to be a critique of this system where marriage equals political alliance, where passion can only be silent, then of course they go together. Of course it's complementary. I really like that. You see what I mean? Like, this is one of those books where everything is layered. Everything is a puzzle. And there are just 626 ways from Sunday to read it all. And people do, and they fight about it in print, in ink, over, the last millennium on this stuff. Okay, I'm gonna move forward to talk a little bit about, so we've talked a little bit about colors and plants, and those colors are gonna come back. But now I wanna talk about location and layouts, and so I just want to reiterate that Genji, the Tale of Genji is set in the city we now know as Kyoto, right? And that was the old imperial capital. It was known by a different name then, Heian, Kyo, the city to the south of the Korean. For what it's worth, the names of the bodies of water there, I got this map from Britannica.com. I believe the US, last time I checked, the federal government's maps of those bodies of water in English, they will also talk about Sea of Japan. If you have friends from Korea or China, they will take issue with that name. That is a contested body of water. So I just want to acknowledge that the Sea of Japan may not resonate for everybody in the room, but that is the map I pulled because it had a nice star on Kyoto. So that's what I'm using it for. Okay, so here's the thing about the old capital. And now I'm not talking about a fictional garden or a fictional city. I'm talking about the city, right? Kyoto has a lovely grid plan. It still has a lovely grid plan. It is really hard to get lost in Kyoto. I have zero navigational sense, and even I cannot get too far lost in Kyoto, okay? This is not an accident, and it's not because they were worried about people getting lost when the city was founded in 794, Common Era. One of the benefits of having the descendant of the sun goddess on the throne is that you feel fairly confident, year 1000 Japan, that the gods are on your side. And if you are a culture that emerges in part from rice farming or any kind of agricultural pursuit, then having the sun goddess on your side is a really good thing, right? The weather matters. Timely rains, as we all know too well, matter. And so you want the right person on the throne. You also want to signal, right? It's a kind of sympathetic magic. You also want to signal that this orderly line of descent from the sun goddess down to the emperor is manifested in and helps to make manifest elsewhere an orderly state, an orderly citizenry. So you want your populace to be well ordered. You have a nice orderly urban grid. You want your streets to be well protected. You have, and this is I'm gonna sort of go very quickly and just say a kind of feng shui. You want disorderly impulses to be swept away. You situate your city where there's water that flows and sweeps away the disorder. You might also choose to build a city surrounded by mountains that can further protect the city from malign forces. And those malign forces can enter from various places. This is a form of urban planning borrowed from, in the case of the Heian capital, the old form of Kyoto, borrowed from China. You want to protect, in particular, the so-called devil's gates, where malignant forces can enter. And one of them is up in the northeast. And so what you have to this day, to the northeast of Kyoto, is not just a mountain, which was obviously there to begin with, but a huge temple complex, the Mount Hiei Temple Complex. And you see a little image of it from a billboard or a photo board on the mountain, sort of marking all the sub-temples and things. So that mountain is to the northeast of the city, protecting the city. And then the Imperial Palace is this square up at the top that I'm pointing to, like a finger to the moon, right there. It's in the center, and the emperor sits there and looks out, which is why this side of the city is called the left capital, and the other side is called the right. When we look at it, it seems flipped, right? But if your perspective is the emperor, then this is the left, and this is the right. And so Genji's garden, and the readers, the real flesh and blood readers of that fictional garden, right? They live in a city in which the layout is significant, right? It matters. It suggests things about order. And remember, what are those mountains doing? They're protecting us from the demons and the demon's gate. And what are these demons or devils, or oni is the Japanese term? What are they like? They are disorderly. So it's, you know, you can tell a lot about a culture by how they imagine good and evil, right? Evil in this rendition, and I would not say that this is a terribly serious rendition, again, I'm going for lighthearted tonight, but is evil here is our chief demon. This is a big bowl of sake, drinking, and his demonic attendants, visible from their brightly colored skin and their various horns, they're also drinking and having a grand old time. And these people with the funny hats and pom-poms, they're mountain priests, actually warriors in disguise, and they're coming to defeat the demons in the demon's lair. But it's just an example of what counts as a malignant influence. It's the disorderly type, where we're not restraining ourselves, where we're not harmoniously well-ordered and everything is in its box, okay? So, it's good to know, before we go to that next puzzle, that Kyoto's a grid, and we imagine the orderly space as auspicious, right? That disorder is demonic. And that demons don't have to be literal. They don't have to have the fancy horns and bright green skin. My students often make the mistake of thinking that people 1,000 years ago were less sophisticated intellectually than we are. Like, oh, well, they always thought of things as having one meaning. Again, I think most puzzles, most codes worth engaging with actually are complex. There's room for play. And so there are absolutely stories about real demons going on. There are also poems, including this one, this little journal entry by the author of the Tale of Genji, known as Murasaki, right? There are also understandings that, hey, someone's suffering from a demon attack. Maybe the demon's just in their heart. Now, what is the source of disorder? Is it sake swilling monsters living in the mountains? Or maybe it's our own impulses, right? So I just want to flag these things, that order is good, that devil's gates, demon's gates exist, and what they bring in is chaos. Right? And more specifically, chaos of an emotional sort. Again, if your state is founded on orderly descent, if marriage is arranged and a political contract, then you want to be really careful about clandestine romance and repressed passion, because it has a way of coming out. Okay? All right, so here's your puzzle, number 2. Genji goes and builds his own pseudo-palace. Note that nice box shape. We go back to the map of Kyoto. That nice box compound, the Grand Palace, which also had its gardens. So Genji, in the story, builds his own palace compound. He collects all his women to himself. The only other person who does that, year 1000 Japan, realistically, the emperor. Otherwise, they practice what's known in English as commuter marriage, kaiyokon, where the man visits the woman at her parents' home. The emperor brings them all in, because you can't have the emperor wandering the streets. Well, Genji's like, I should have been emperor. He brings all his women to himself, constructs his own palace, and you'll see just how orderly it is. He also builds gardens for his women. So take a look at this nice orderly grid. Again, we're looking top down, right? These are buildings, and then nice open hallways extended over the gardens, right? You can imagine an expanded tea house, right? And these are ponds, and then islands with greenery in the ponds. We're looking down, right? So Genji collects 4 of his many women to his house, right? And he gives them each a quadrant, right? And you can see that 3 of the quadrants have nice water features, and 1 of them does not. What do you think about that? You're the recipient of one of these gardens. You've walked through Anderson Gardens and you've paid attention to how much effort it takes to keep them pruned. How much is Genji working on his relationship with each of these women? Who gets the most attention? Who gets the least? How would you read that? And I should add that this garden up here looks like it's smaller. The top rectangle, what you're looking at, is the roof of storehouses. So she has a full quadrant, but instead of having like more garden space or a pond, that's where all the valuables are kept. Think about that. Marriage is a political alliance. Romance, secret affairs, are about love. And plants and flowers and water. If you think of water, you're 1000 Japan, you should think of tears. If you think of tears, you could think of love, because if you love someone, by definition, you're not publicly acknowledging them, right? You've got to hide it. So looking at this garden plan, what would you infer about our hero's relationships and his feelings, just generally? You're introducing this guy to a friend. How do you characterize it? This is seriously another not right answer question. People have argued about Genji. Oh, he's great. He's the Buddha himself. No, he's terrible. He is disorder incarnate. Hey, I'm period courier.
Well, certainly the upper left,
Yeah.
since that's all storehouses
Yeah.
and valuable things.
Yeah.
Well, she's got a lot of power, because
Yeah.
she's holding all
Yeah.
these things. And her garden seems to have a lot more greenery, needs a lot more care.
There's a
She's
lot
gonna
of
be
greenery.
busy with that.
Mhm.
She can't get into trouble with maybe other.
There's no water, right? No, none of that like disastrous. Yeah. Yeah.
So, maybe has fewer opportunities to be unfaithful.
Okay, I like it. I like it. And in fact, so the one Japanese pun that works well in English, most of them don't. And this is terrible for people like me because there's so many puns. The Tale of Genji. But pine trees, lots of greenery. That's the kind of tree that is up in that corner. Pine trees signify waiting. So matsu, pine tree, and matsu, to wait. English, we're so close. Because when you wait, you're sad, right? Maybe. Pine trees mean you pine. That's the idea. You wait, you don't get involved in other things. So yeah, again, really astute, that reading of it. Yes,
If
please.
she has all the valuables or
Yeah.
has access to them,
Yeah.
there'd have to be a strong level of trust.
Right, absolutely, very strong level of trust. And indeed, she, the woman there, Lady Akashi, as she is known, is the biological mother of Genji's only daughter. And if you've been booted from the imperial family, the only way you get the only legitimate way you get your blood back on the throne is you marry your child in, your daughter in. There was a whole debate in Japanese media, I don't know, 10 years ago about, oh, there's only a princess. Are we gonna have the prospect of an empress, like ruling Japan? And now that's receded because she has cousins, including a male cousin, but Princess Aiko, that is. But in any case, yes, this woman up here has the valuable daughter. She's got all the formal signs of importance, the storehouse, the trust, and none of the love. But Genji's love, there's plenty to go around, right? And in fact, some of them seem to be connected. Like, what's the connection between these two women, right? So anyway, you can think about those things as water, as not just fertility, but as love, and tears as an index of love. But of course, tears also as chaotic and disorderly and all of those things. Okay, one more thing. So here's how Genji planted their gardens, in case you wondered. And he does not control the seasons, although there is a very interesting reading of Genji's palace as an attempt to control the seasons, because he only plants spring things down here. He only plants summer things up there. He only plants, or things that look good in spring, things that look good in summer. Pine trees look great in winter. I think all of us who live in the upper Midwest can agree with that. So nice, covered with snow, right? And then this is autumn, right? I know that I've got to push my way through. I will be fine by 8 o'clock, but since you guys are gardeners, or excited about gardens, how would you feel about being relegated to one season? I mean, as a lazy gardener, I may be like, just pines. I could do it, zero work for me. Maybe my husband would disagree out there proving that. Any thoughts on this? Do you ever think about like the seasonal significance? Like spring, the birth of love. So I'm a New Englander, right? Plenty of New England poets, Robert Frost, Emily Dickinson, Edna St. Vincent Millay. They use metaphors that Japanese poets would like recognize, right? So spring, new love. Winter, icy death, no love at all. It is winter with your love. The sash, it is beset with snow, is a Malay poem. It's just for me. Summer and autumn are the interesting seasons, and they get by far the most poetry. And if you see lots of Japanese artworks represented, if you start to track and pay attention, it is much more likely to be spring and autumn that get the illustrations, but summer and autumn are kind of interesting seasons in the romantic calendar. Why would summer be very romantic, do you think?
Oh, it's warm, it's established.
Mm-hmm.
So you had spring, just beginning,
Yep.
and then now they're enjoying themselves.
Absolutely.
And they can look forward to fall.
And winter is a long way from there.
Yeah. So it's an interesting time.
Yeah.
When, things have blossomed, they aren't going to begin to fade away.
Yeah.
Into that later maturity.
So it's sort of like love, maybe not love triumphant. I don't want to do the sort of rose flower language much, but like very passionate, right? Heated is sort of the mnemonic device I use with students, right? The nights are also shorter. So if you're feeling very passionate, when you like, my husband and I have been married for like almost 20 years, right? So, I will miss him when I'm in Japan for the next 3 weeks teaching. But I feel it's established, we're gonna be okay, right? But new love, your secret lovers, you can only meet at night. Summer nights are really short. So again, sort of a season of volatility, instability, disorder, right? Right? So of course it's in the Devil's Gate. And I also want to add, just because I have to, right? So the storehouses, which you can see a little bit better in this representation, all those roofs with snow. Genji puts his library in the summer quarter. What's in the Devil's Gate? All those books, all those love stories like the Tale of Genji is what gets put there. I'll also just add that actually another Devil's Gate, there's more than one, but is the Southwest. And it's very interesting to me that autumn gets put there. There's a Japanese pun which does not work that well in English at all. Autumn is aki, and then in Japanese, in modern Japanese, it'd be akitakuru, to get sick of something. In classical Japanese, the gerund form of that would be aki, so it's a pun. The autumn is the time, it's the season of surfeit, right? Like your tomatoes are ripening and the first 50 taste fantastic. And then when you're still canning, if you do this, right? It's like, I can't take another zucchini. Please make it go away. So autumn is very interesting in sort of this affective, this emotional calendar, because it's when you start to get sick of things. It's like, does he love me? Does she love me? I don't know. Right. So anyway, Devil's Gate is summer. So that's interesting. I'm going to skip over the fact that the further comparison, and we can come back to the grid in Genji's palace if you find that interesting to think about. So here's our final puzzle, where we will build on some of this knowledge about colors and plants and layouts. So Genji throws lots of parties in his gardens. Maybe not unlike the summer festival that you guys will all be enjoying in not too long here. And at those parties, people compose all sorts of poems, because poetry was a party game back in the day. I do not mean to diminish its artistic value, right? Someday people will read Facebook posts and Twitter messages, and I'm not on social media, so maybe they are well worth reading and artistic, but my immediate response is like, yeah, right? There's an awful lot of yeah, right poetry churned out because it's a party game 1,000 years ago, right? But this is an imaginary party, right? The author of the Tale of Genji imagined this garden into existence in her book, imagines all the party game poems in the book. So they're meaningful, they're puzzles. And the characters are sending each other little messages, and then maybe the author is hinting things to the reader, and nobody agrees on what anybody means, what Genji means when he writes a poem, what the author wants us to read, because sometimes authors know things that their characters don't. So that's another debate. Does the author admire the hero, or does she think he's a jerk and she's putting him in these situations where he looks like a jerk? So, for you to say. But here's the poem. And it's about the spring garden. He throws a big boating party, so you can see the dragon-faced and the phoenix. Sure looks more like a rooster. I don't want to think it's a phoenix. I'll have to look it up. But anyway, the dragon-faced and bird-faced boats. And here are some of those mountain roses, those Yamabuki, here in that silent yellow, being reflected in the water. Remember, those gardens are connected. Pick up the map. The garden, so this is the autumn garden, this is the spring garden, these are the most celebrated seasons artistically. So Genji's like, let's have a party. And he has a party in spring, and he has the woman who he desires here. He actually had an affair with her mother, but she's not his child, so he's got that going for him. They sail boats back and forth, and they compose poems about the beauties of the spring garden, and this is one of those poems, okay? So this blossoming pond of garden in spring. Blossoming pond because the flowers are reflected in it, just like the trees, etc., are reflected in the gardens out there in the water. This blossoming pond of a garden in spring is so like the rapids where mountain roses bloom in watery depths. He refers to the rapids in a particular river, the rapids of Ide. I cut the name because I thought it was distracting. It's so like the rapids where mountain roses bloom in watery depths. And I find this utterly confusing. I really do. That's why I picked it up, because I will learn something. Even if we're all equally confused at the end, you will still come up with ideas that I don't have. Let's remember what we've learned. We're going to try to think about what is this communicating? What things, multiple, might this be communicating, right? So, it's about that spring garden, but the convention is that most of those poems in the garden are warnings. Why? When Genji throws this party, he's entered middle age. And he should be happy. He should finally have everything he wants. But of course nobody wants. What they want when they get it is the theory of the author. And Genji gets antsy. Oh, this is my favorite wife, isn't it? Oh, the spring garden is my favorite garden, isn't it? And then he starts stealing away to the summer garden. And he starts leaving to visit other women in other secondary estates that he's got, right? So, as a reminder, right, that yellow color, the mountain roses suggest silence, but it's silence about feelings that you can barely repress. The layout of the garden, right, you would think this is a Devil's Gate up here, that's the northeast, summer, and this is a Devil's Gate southwest. So I don't know what it means that he's having the party here, although spring inevitably goes to summer. Isn't that the next stop? So maybe that's part of it. Water in general suggests affection, love. So many love poems are about the depths of your feelings. You compare your love to a waterfall, raging affection. But then it also suggests tears. So many poems about tears with love. And then, of course, the depths of the water. We haven't talked about rapids. Like, what would it mean to contrast depths that are capable of reflecting flowers, and then rapids, which move quickly? So, I am sure that someone somewhere, and why not in this room, will come up with the definitive reading of this poem. But you should relieve yourself of the burden of figuring out what I think, because I don't know. There's not a lot of consensus on this one, as it happens. So what do you think about this? Like, it's not like this is just an example of bad poetry. Maybe the author decided, I better throw a bad poem in there too, to make it realistic. But if it's potentially meaningful, if someone is trying to say something, what do you think it means? What would it mean to talk about a garden in spring being like rapids? I'm super risk averse, so I'm not into whitewater rafting. I've quite literally avoided it for decades. High school graduation trip, everybody went whitewater rafting, I skipped. So how is that comparable? And if it's not comparable, what do you think of it? Yeah,
Do you think he maybe means youth? Like
Okay.
his youth, like spring springtime, it's a rebirth, it's
Yeah.
youth. And then rapids, youth moves quickly.
Yeah.
And then he's talking about mountain roses, we had talked about the yellow being the depths. So he's looking back, like youth moves by so quickly, and he's maybe looking at something with maybe regret or like keeping it silent, like his sorrow of, you said he was older at
Yeah.
this point. So his youth has faded away. So
And
he's
so
probably
he's-
trying to keep it, like his sadness that
Yeah.
he's growing older. And that
He's
youth
getting
is gone.
older, yeah. And I can't remember if Genji wrote this or one of the party guests wrote that, but it's even worse if it's one of the party guests, like
Yeah,
one of the young
exactly.
porters out and about, yeah.
Well, you're partying with people who are probably your age.
Yeah.
So, probably a mixed crowd, but more or less probably around your own age. So it's probably just talking about youth and how just youth is very fleeting. So,
Love that.
my best guess.
I think that's a fabulous guess, and I've worked on a book, or my most recent work has been on a book that's like largely inspired by Genji, still about a millennium ago, and its opening lines are, "The spring of youth is fleeting." I mean, in translation, obviously.
Right.
"The spring of youth is fleeting, but it was already the 4th month." And then it goes on to allude to this chapter. Thank you. I bet you're right. So it's a reminiscence about youth and the passage of time. Other thoughts on this? It's usually more than one thing going on. Yeah, Jody.
I'm going with Genji was a perv.
There's ample evidence to support that claim from a certain perspective.
I'm thinking, like, if you thought of this about the context of a woman that he loved, the blossoming pond of the
Yeah.
garden, in spring was when this person was young,
Yeah.
and the rapids was the passage of time
Yeah.
and aging. And then once they aged, that mountain rose, that beauty was silenced with the image of yellow. And watery depths somehow to me inspires death. So I don't
Okay.
know if it's the death of his love because she aged. So I'm going with the young perv. That's what I'm going with.
What about the depth of her beauty? I say depth of her beauty.
Right.
Depth of her
Before
beauty.
she was
Yes.
surface beauty, you
Mm.
fell in
Oh,
love
good
with
one.
her,
I like
and
it.
now she's matured
So
and,
maybe his-
and she
And his
and-
love matured to something
Right.
beyond just the physical beauty.
Oh,
That's a
so
good reading.
the Genji fans and the Genji
Yeah.
haters could both work with this reading. I have to say, so here's the thing. One of the reasons that there are so many different thoughts about Genji, so I noted in one of the earlier slides that Genji's like favorite wife, for whom the author is named, like the character isn't named for her. The character was really popular, and so people started calling the author by her character's name. It's like if people started calling Shakespeare Romeo, because they like it or whatever. So his favorite wife, Murasaki, lives here. The reason Genji, sorry, honey, I apologize. The reason that Jody thinks of Genji as a perv is because he takes in Murasaki when she's a little girl.
Insider knowledge.
Yeah, when we were dating, he was like, "What do I have to do?" I was like, "Read the Tale of Genji." True story. Anyway, he takes her in and he raises her as his daughter, and so she's a lot younger than him. And then she grows up, and my students who think that it is a kind of perfected love over time, that if you want to use kind of Judeo-Christian language, which these students tend to do, that Murasaki redeems Genji, that his love for her redeems him as a character, right? And that is a reading that has fans, maybe not always framed in the terms that I have, but there are people who think this. That he celebrates her as his Lady of Spring, where the love is always fresh and eternal. But what I like about your reading, and not just because I'm feeling flippant as usual, is that the woman in this garden I mentioned is the daughter of one of his old lovers. So it's another daughter figure, and he's never involved with the daughter because the mother's like, "I will haunt you." And in fact, she does haunt him, right? Yeah. And so these two are kind of parallel in a weird way. It's like the path not taken. She escaped Genji, she didn't. Or Genji supported her romantically and he supported her political career. She marries the emperor, also Genji's secret son. But anyway, she marries him. And so the fact that they're connected here might suggest that. Now the mature beauty, right, the like deepening of love, I could also see that because spring comes every year. And Murasaki, when she dies, is still, and you can hear my Catholic upbringing in my phrasing, she is still Our Lady of Spring. You know, she is utterly associated with plants and creatures of spring, butterflies in particular. So there's that. Yeah, I like it. Any other thoughts? You guys are so good at this. Any other thoughts on that poem? Like, silence blooming in watery depths. Something blooms, it's showy, right? You can see it. I mean, is he crying? Is somebody making fun of Genji? Like, all this water in these corners? I really don't know. If you enjoy this kind of game, I really recommend the Tale of Genji to you. There are several different translations, even in English. If you're into historical detail, Royal Tyler version is probably the most accessible. It gives you lots and lots of like background information. Lately, my English readers have really liked the Dennis Washburn translation. They consider it more like of a story. It pulls you in more. This is their take. I really like the side sticker version because I read it first, I suppose. And if you read other languages, there are many versions of Genji out there. There are competing versions in Spanish and Chinese. I think there's still just one Korean translation. There are versions in Russian. Like, you can compare and contrast. And in fact, my students do this, and the characters sound different, and the puzzles solve different. Every version you look at. So I strongly encourage you to take a look. It's really a fun thing to do. But as I close, to leave enough time for some Q&A, I will just remind you that while we've been talking about sort of fantasy gardens, right? The practice of sending messages through built and, I was going to say natural, but there's nothing really natural about a Japanese garden, right? It's very carefully tended. The practice of using gardens to communicate things predates the Tale of Genji historically in Japan and elsewhere, and continued afterwards, right? So there were people who designed gardens inspired by the gardens in the Tale of Genji and other books to signal their education, to maybe gesture toward the books that they've read for their own entertainment. We planted pawpaws in our backyard because I read about them in a Catherine Ann Porter book when I was a kid, and I was like, what's a pawpaw? I want to know what that is. More interesting when we think about politics and politicized relationships is a garden that predates Genji, 9th century garden, by an aristocrat who, like Genji, was born a prince, and like Genji, was stripped of that status, probably for similar reasons. Not just that they had their heir and spare, but that there were political factions who supported one mother and not another. Remember, emperors multiple times. He built in his backyard, maybe it was his front yard, he built a replica of the coast, complete with lots of salt water that he had brought in from Osaka Bay, or what we would now think of as Osaka Bay. And he had attendants who dressed as fisher folk and would boil off that water in order to reenact the sad but so exotic for a court-based elite life of the people who created salt and lived on the coast. Salt water in Japanese poetry, I don't think Frost does this, he does, suggests tears. And so if you're somebody whose career has not gone the way you wanted, maybe poetically recreating the sea in your backyard to suggest all those salt tears is not a bad move for indulging your melancholy, but also cultivating sympathy. Certainly, he cultivated a reputation as an exquisitely aesthetically sensitive courtier. And that, at least in the Tale of Genji, is about the highest praise you can give someone. That they're sensitive, that they know what much later critics of the Tale of Genji refer to as the sadness of things. So I am not suggesting that Anderson Gardens, right, were designed to communicate a message beyond love of whatever. They certainly also communicate wealth and status, and there's that. But you can play this game. You can read in English about gardens that were designed to make you think of sutras, about features that are designed to make you think of the Isles of the Immortals, or Horai or Panglai, depending on which East Asian language you work on. There are many ways to read a garden that do not require somebody to have memorized the names of every plant and their significance, which is good news for somebody like me. But if you also know the plants and you have given some thought to design, you can get a whole lot more out of a garden. You can make a game of it. I know, play is good for us, right? Maybe especially in challenging times. So, that is my presentation on Genji's gardens. Once in a while, I team teach the Tale of Genji with a wonderful colleague of mine, Rania Huntington, who is a specialist in early modern Chinese literature. And she teaches The Dream of the Red Chamber, otherwise known as The Story of the Stone. And I select my favorite chapters from Genji, and she selects her favorite chapters from that much longer work, and it too has a lot of space devoted to an imaginary garden. So this way of thinking about landscape in fictional gardens, and at least in Japan, in built ones, will serve you well. You will get more out of it if you start thinking about what it might suggest about feelings, at least. I would be delighted to talk through things and to hear more of your ideas about anything that I've had up on the screen, because this is super helpful for me. But that's not the reason you attended. So if I can be helpful to you, I would love to do that. I'm gonna take a sip of water.
I have a question
Yes.
about how this was written.
Mm.
Was it written by a man or a woman? Do they know?
Tale of Genji is one of the works that we can assign an author, but. So we do not have the original manuscript of the Tale of Genji. The version we have is at least a couple hundred years after the author finished. And even while she, and it was a she, Murasaki Shikibu, daughter of a mid-level courtier, even while she was writing, the manuscript was being circulated. She was receiving feedback, including from her patron and empress, and depending on who you read, probably from the empress's father, a very prominent politician by the name of Fujiwara Ichinaga. And so the extent to which we can credit the Tale of Genji to any one person is itself, we are not to imagine the solitary writer, right? But Murasaki Shikibu existed. We know some biological, historical things about her. And that first manuscript we have, they're always uncovering things in long elite family storehouses, but the oldest manuscript we have of it, I want to say, is in the hand of Fujiwara Teika, a man who was a student of the Tale of Genji's poetry. And Teika liked to improve things, and so he cleaned up the competing manuscript lineages. There were ways to reproduce, not really printing presses, but they were reproducing sutras in something that you could think of as somewhat mechanically, as an analogy, in the Han period. But they weren't doing that with secular works. So things changed a lot. And the book that I actually spend more of my time on, The Tale of Sagormo, the so-called Second Genji, written about 50 years after it, nobody cleaned up those manuscripts. And the differences are enormous. Characterization, sequence of events, the poems themselves, which were for centuries the most important parts of these books for the people who took the time to preserve it. Genji survived because a whole lot of people made hand copies of it. In English translation, it's over 1,000 pages. It's a lot of work. It was a status item just to have a copy of it. So, yeah.
Can I ask
Yeah,
another
of course.
question? From the very little
Yeah.
that I know about it, tiny. It seems to me that men of court spoke one level of language,
Yeah.
and the women spoke a more personal
I mean, I would say this, the aristocrats, who were a teeny tiny percentage of Japanese at the time, right? Like a small group, maybe the population of Japan, I always get this off, I'll regret this later, but I wanna say it was like 100,000 people maybe was the population of Kyoto, and maybe 10,000 of those, or Hankyo, and maybe 10,000 were aristocrats, but I always get the zeros wrong on that one. It was a very small group of people. They were really well educated, the people involved in Genji. And so they spoke a form of what we would think of as Japanese. Most of them read what we would think of as Chinese, and then maybe a version that's sort of midway between the two. A Sino-Japanese, the term for it these days is literary Sinitic, Kanbun, or something like it. And yes, the Japanese in which Genji is written is associated with women, but lots of men wrote it. The content, the bigger distinction is content. So like male courtier diaries, generally written in this stiffer kind of midway between Japanese and Chinese. I'm grossly oversimplifying, I'm sorry, I'm not a historical linguist. But it's written in a different language, and you talk about certain kinds of things, different things. You don't talk about personal matters, to your point. And so there's a gendering of language to the extent that stuff that's written in the vernacular, the spoken language, is considered the woman's hand. When you write that way, it's feminine writing, but men write it too. And when you write about feelings, or like the death of your daughter, thinking of a text called the Tosa Diary, which was written by a man, but he wrote it in the woman's language because he wanted to talk about the death of his kid. So they get to choose between levels of language, right? And when I talk with my students about it, you know, as Americans, we are so much less formal in a lot of ways than a lot of people. And the distance between contemporary Upper Midwestern use of English maybe and classical Japanese at the court 1,000 years ago is immense. So the best I can do is register. Like the way I talk to my spouse, even though I'm a pretty informal lecturer, is not the way I talk to my students. And it's definitely not the way I would talk to my department chair. Now I'm department chair, so I get to talk however I want, but before then. So yeah, I mean, you're right, and it's complicated because men wrote that way too. It's more like there's the personal mode and the public mode. Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't think that really answers your question.
No, I understand that because it's like the translations.
Yeah.
Inevitably, a translator brings that person's worldview to the table.
Oh, absolutely.
So, you know, this person has that worldview, and
Yeah.
that one has a different worldview.
Yeah.
They're not gonna
So I
necessarily
totally
meet at
agree.
all.
And when I teach the Tale of Genji, I'm like, you can read whatever translation you want, because everything you read is a translation. Even if you're reading in Japanese, it's modern Japanese, it's a translation. Even if you're reading in classical Japanese, you're probably reading a typeset version, it's a translation. I have a colleague at U-Michigan, Reggie Jackson, who has a wonderful book. It's like dense to get through, but it's so fascinating. Talking about textures of mourning, he talks about reading the calligraphy and the style in which something is written. So a typeset version, like computer version, that's a translation, right? So I tell students, this is the version I will write quizzes from, so that we all have the same sense of which season, what color, which plant, because it's in English and that's our language of instruction. I want them to read from a second translation. And then we compare them, and they have projects where they pick their favorite passage in one, and then they look it up in another, and we talk about how different it is. Yeah, so if you have the time, read two at the same time. Why not, right?
I have a very
Yes.
simple
Yes. Oh dear.
How is Hikaru?
Yes.
Hikaru
Yes.
is translated in English. What is his name in English?
So he is, sometimes people will talk about him as the shining Genji,
Shining.
the shining. So they translate Hikaru as shining. But you know, the reference to a name, as I suspect you know, is complicated, right? Because Genji isn't a personal name.
No.
It's a status. It's someone who was demoted from the imperial family. So I've talked about Genji as if it's a person, but you could read this as really a story about this kind of person, right?
But his name is Hikaru, right? Yeah.
So the classical text, they refer to him, there's a visiting physiognomist, somebody who reads reads facial features and bumps, there's another fancy word for this, but it's just like reading facial features. I can't think of what it is. Phrenologist, I don't know. Anyway, he referred to, or the text says, it is said that the visitor from Koma, one of the name of the ancient kingdoms on what we now think of as the Korean Peninsula, it is said that he referred to this young prince as the shining prince, Hikaru Kimi. And then in the next chapter, we find out that Genji has been demoted, in part because this visitor from across the sea, whatever we call it, Sea Japan or not, visitor from across the sea, predicted if you let him be emperor, there's going to be trouble. But if you don't, still going to be trouble. There's debates over how to read the prophecy too, right? And so then the next chapter, the narrator, who is probably a different narrator, like each chapter seems to be narrated by a slightly different person, or there's that argument made. That second chapter says, the shining Genji, Hikaru Genji, I think, I have to go back and look. The name was imposing, the name was grand, the person not so much. So the narrator in the first chapter thinks he's great, the narrator in the second chapter is throwing shade on him, and not every English translator pays attention to those differences. But I just want to say one more thing about this. So Genji has kids, and then those kids have kids, and his friends have kids. It's a very long book. And one of the kids is called Nio Nomiya. Nio, right? And so Hikaru, shining, suggests that imperial lineage, the sun goddess, right? It's that splendor. Nio suggests both a visual splendor, like plum blossoms glow, but then also a scent, a fragrance. And then Nio's best buddy, and they're all related to the first generation in various ways that I don't want to plot spoil because it's super interesting. But Nio is sort of like Genji, but he blends all his own perfumes. So he may be naturally good looking, but he's really working to smell good. Everything Genji did was effortless, right? Nio's buddy, Kaoru, suggests a nice fragrance, right? But these are all nicknames added by later readers. Like when you read through the text, he's like, oh, it's Kaoru Chujo. It's the middle captain who smelled so good. That one. There's lots of middle captains. You know, the one who smells great. Hikaru Genji. That Genji, that demoted prince. You know, the one who's so dazzling. So I don't know that I like Side Sticker as a translation because he doesn't change the names. Tyler changes the names, but that's much closer to the original text. Washburn tries to avoid using names. I don't know what your thoughts on Washburn are, but so yeah, but the typical in English has been the shining Genji. I don't know how much more patience you have with me going on, but if people have other things they want to raise, I'm happy to go with it.
I have one question.
Yes, sir.
And it's kind of off to the side.
Yeah.
It's a different story, I think, or a collection of stories with the Tales of Issei.
Yes, I love Tales of
And how
Issei.
they connect with Tales of Genji.
Mhm.
And I know we have like a physical reference from Tales of Issei in the garden with the Yatsuhashi.
The Yatsuhashi, this exact written. So Tales of Issei, written about maybe 50 years to a century before. Some of the dating is tough. Maybe I'm just being sloppy, don't remember. But Tales of Issei involves a charismatic person, also because, like, if you live in a society where marriage is political and romance is clandestine, your escape is to read about clandestine romance, right? From people who should know better. Either that or we all like celebrities. Anyway, the hero of Tales of Issei is himself somebody from one of these family lineages where there was a prince and then he got demoted, and he's so Narihira, the protagonist of Tales of Issei, is a direct model for Genji. And we know this because, so chapter 1, Genji, the shining prince. Chapter 2, oh yeah, the shining commoner, not so hot. People read the structure of the tale as like the public chapters and the private chapters. You get two different beginnings, and they meet in chapter 5. Waka Murasaki, young Murasaki, this little girl who Genji sees, and he's like, oh, she looks just like my stepmother. I'd like to see her when she grows up. Why don't I raise her so she can be my perfect woman? Anyway, that chapter starts out by calling to mind Tales of Issei. And in Tales of Issei, Narihira goes into exile. And maybe it's because he's distressed romantically, because he can't have the woman he wants, also an empress, not his stepmother. and then the commentators are like, wow, this really happened, because he's a real person. And wow, he really went into exile. And so I was thinking of him looking at that scroll in the Tokonoma in the Gospels. And then other people were like, well, no, he just hid out on the eastern side of the city. Or like, no, he didn't go anywhere. So competing readings. But Tales of Issei and that notion of a hero who feels isolated, politically, romantically, alone, despite all of his charm and charisma, that is absolutely an influence on Genji, and it is made explicit in chapter 5, which is where the public and private lines of the tale, if you go in for structural readings of the book, come together. Because Genji has been married formally to somebody. He's like, I wish I could have a wife I really wanted. I wish I could have a wife like my stepmother. And Murasaki, the little Murasaki, she's his stepmother's niece. And so her name is Murasaki. She's named for that plant whose roots, when you squeeze them, create this gorgeous purple dye. So his stepmother is known as Fujitsubo, wisteria, lavender, wisteria. And so there's this like ongoing series of botanical allusions to different characters. Yeah, so Narihira, the people talk about Narihira a lot in terms of Genji. It's most explicit in chapter 5. And you could also start reading the book there. And just like chapter 5, this is where it all comes together, and you go from there. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I was probably thinking a little more along the lines of a poetic scene from the tales and how it was illustrated in the garden as a physical.
Oh, in the garden. So let me give you a different Issei reference that would be more meaningful for this garden. So that Yatsuhashi reference, right? There is a lovely early medieval memoir called The Confessions of Lady Nijo. Been translated that way. It's actually a tale no one asked for, Towazagatari. And in it, a woman who is always comparing herself to characters in Tale of Genji and this is like a historical actor who was involved with an emperor who restaged events from the Tale of Genji, not in his garden, but like in his court. And she's mad because she didn't get the role of Murasaki. She got the Akashi lady, like the valuable political wife, and he doesn't really know. She got that role, I think, like that. Anyway, she wasn't happy. She talks about going to the place where the Yatsuhashi, the 8 bridges, are, to see the irises. And she puts in her diary, she's like, the irises all dried up. They're not there anymore. How could this be, right? Because for generations, because that book is like, I want to say it's 13th century, it could be 12th, I think it's 13th. Anyway, she says, I've been reading all these poems. People go there, and they're writing poems, just like Narihira did. But actually, the irises are no longer there because the marsh has dried up. So there are lots of poets. Saigyo is one, Basho is another, who follow in Narihira's footsteps, at least in his journey to the east, where he goes into exile, if you believe he actually left the city and didn't just hide out nearby. So there's lots. I cannot think off the top of my head of a scene that in Genji that riffs off of the Yatsuhashi, the 8 bridges, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. I haven't taught Genji in a couple of years, so I will look for it this year when I'm teaching it and let you know. Yeah. I have a colleague at WashU in St. Louis, Jamie Newhart, who is an Issei specialist, and in her office she has a reproduction of a painting of irises, and then she has her table set up like Yatsuhashi under it, and I, like an idiot, walk in there and I'm like, is that a Yatsuhashi reference? And it was just so obvious, she was just shaking her head. It's like, you have to ask, really. So there are examples elsewhere in the Midwest of people doing that. It's a puzzle, right? Maybe she gives extra credit for her students if they show up and they ask that question, but she was just dismayed that I felt I needed to show her that I knew. The people who know don't say it right, so I failed.
Well, thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.